Good morning, everyone. We're pleased to call this hearing to order today. Today, as you know, we're going to be discussing a topic that's priority for many of us on the Environment and Public Works Committee, and that is reducing methane emissions from landfills and how we can do that through deploying new and innovative technologies while improving waste management and increasing the use of existing solutions like composting. We'll also explore how addressing methane emissions can create new jobs, a lot of them, and provide new revenue streams for landfill operators. Over the past couple of centuries, methane concentrations in the atmosphere have more than doubled. And methane, as many of you know, is roughly 80 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. As a result, the super pollutant is responsible for roughly a third of the global warming our planet is currently experiencing. I'm going to say that again. This super pollutant is responsible for roughly a third of the global warming that our planet is currently experiencing, a third. This makes cleaning up methane emissions one of the fastest ways to mitigate the global warming. In fact, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, strong, rapid, and sustained methane reduction are critical to limiting near-term warming. 2 years ago, I traveled some of our colleagues to Scotland for COP26 and also with members of our staff. That is when the United States and the European Union launched the Global Methane Pledge. And this agreement represents a collective effort to reduce global methane emissions by at least 30% over the next 10 years. Today, more than 150 countries have signed on to that pledge. 150 countries have signed on to that pledge. More recently, I attended COP28 in Dubai, bipartisan delegation of our colleagues led by Senator Cardin. There, governments and private industry renewed their commitments to reduce methane emissions. And as an original signatory of the Global Methane Pledge and significant contributor to global methane emissions, the United States must continue to do its part, our part, to drive domestic methane reductions. And short, we need to provide what I call, and what probably you call, leadership by example. So why should we focus on reducing methane emissions? Well, to answer that question, let me begin by sharing the age-old story of Willie Sutton, whom, as some of you will recall, and members of our committee have heard me say more than they want to remember, I suspect. But he was a notorious bank robber during the Great Depression. In fact, he robbed a lot of banks. And finally, he was caught, taken to trial, and they stood before the judge, and the judge famously asked him, he said, "Mr. Sutton, why do you rob banks?" And he replied famously, "Because, Your Honor, that's where the money is." And we can apply the same logic to today's hearing. We have to go where the emissions are and then find ways to reduce them. The good news is that we are well on our way to doing just that. And thanks to the Methane Emissions Reduction Program and the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States is advancing technologies to detect and capture methane emissions from the oil and gas sector as well. Not only will these emissions help us reduce, well, these investments help us reduce emissions, but they will also help us create jobs while recovering wasted energy, enough to power nearly 7 million homes every year. Let me say that again. That's enough to power 7 million homes every year. That's a win-win. It's a win-win for our communities, and it's a win-win for our planet. For this hearing, though, we're going to focus on the next frontier of mitigating methane emissions, and that is landfills. In other words, we're going to, my staff wrote this out for me, they like this. We're going to talk trash. That's pretty good, isn't it? You may ask yourself, why are we concerned about methane emissions from landfills? Landfills and their emissions are largely out of sight. They're largely out of mind for most people. However, landfill methane emissions are the third largest source of methane emissions in the United States and globally. So where is the methane coming from? Well, in the United States, we send more food waste to landfills than any other material. And when organic material like food breaks down in landfills. As you know, it creates methane. And if a landfill is not equipped to capture that methane, it simply escapes into our atmosphere. As many of our colleagues know, I care deeply about finding meaningful ways to reduce our waste while promoting sustainability. And to that end, I'm working alongside Senator Bozeman, Senator Capito, to pass legislation that would strengthen our nation's recycling and composting systems. And while composting and waste diversion are important tools to reduce methane emissions from landfills, it's also important that our landfills are equipped with technology that's necessary to mitigate emissions for years to come. For example, in my home state of Delaware, where one of our witnesses has been a little bit of time, a lot of time actually, the Delaware Solid Waste Authority mitigates methane emissions from their landfills with collection systems. Local businesses then use the gas that was collected to power their emissions. Many landfills across the country use similar systems to capture what would otherwise be wasted energy. As members of our committee have oftentimes heard me say, we need to find out what works, do more of that. And in this case, we also need to find ways to improve upon what is already working. And deploying innovative methods and technologies to limit methane leakage will go a long way toward reducing landfill emissions across the United States. Lastly, in order to fully address this problem, we must be able to identify where the largest releases of methane from landfills are occurring. In fact, over the last couple of years, new studies have begun to reveal the scale of that problem. Satellite monitoring, flyovers, and other enhanced emissions monitoring technologies are playing a growing role in identifying methane emissions from landfills. And these newer detection technologies can help landfill operators quickly respond to large emission events. And we'll need diverse strategies to detect landfill emissions going forward, because traditional methods have been unable to produce accurate emissions data for landfills. Let me close by reminding everybody that if we take action to reduce landfill emissions, it would have an immediate positive impact on climate, on air quality, on public health, and while also creating economic opportunity across our country, especially in our rural areas. My hope is that today's hearing will help us further our committee's understanding of how we can better detect and capture methane emissions from landfills, and what strategies can keep methane-generating organic waste out of landfills in the first place. Before we do that, I want to recognize our ranking member, Senator Capito, for her opening statement. Senator Capito, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding the hearing, and welcome to our panel of witnesses, and thanks for your willingness to testify. As organic materials decompose in landfills, they produce landfill gas containing methane, as the Chairman talked about, the main compound found in natural gas. Due to the natural generation of methane in landfill gas, landfills are now the third largest source, I believe you said that, of methane emissions in the U.S. This may be an environmental problem, but it's also an economic one, as methane lost to the atmosphere can be used for energy or manufacturing. While there's more work to be done and improvements can be made, I want to acknowledge that the U.S. has made a lot of progress in reducing emissions from landfills. Through innovation, thanks to the realization of its monetary value, the landfill sector has significantly improved its capacity to collect and manage landfill gas. Since 1990, U.S. landfills have reduced their greenhouse gas emissions by 38%. Recycling rates are increasing and composting programs are taking off nationwide, meaning less methane-producing materials are ending up in the landfills. Also, the number of landfills are decreasing due to increases in operational efficiencies and improved land use. In considering solutions to address landfill methane that benefit the environment and economic development, it is essential that any regulations are achievable and that incentives are targeted. This is not what we have seen in the approach of this administration, particularly from the Air Office at the EPA, which has pursued punitive regulations that are impossible to achieve, such as Clean Power Plan 2.0 and the misnamed Good Neighbor regulations. The administration has also ladled out billions of funding for favored industries and causes which has been mired in red tape and have not delivered the promised results. We don't want to repeat those mistakes here. And it's important that Congress scrutinize proposed regulations coming out of the Air Office that deal with landfill methane. Natural gas derived from landfill methane can be used to generate reliable electricity or be used as transportation or industrial fuels, all of which promotes energy independence while reducing emissions. But I'm concerned that the landfill sector is facing the same approach that the Biden and the Obama administrations have taken with regard to fossil fuels, where the goal is to make them uneconomic, and then the EPA then works backward to achieve that with crushing regulations. For example, proposed changes to the Clean Air Act's New Source Review program would create a burdensome regulatory landscape for landfills seeking to implement technology innovations to address fugitive methane emissions. Despite receiving increased enforcement scrutiny for methane emissions, landfills have not been able to access the emissions reductions tax credits by the so-called Inflation Reduction Act and have been shut out from the EPA's implementation of the Renewable Fuel Standard. Did I say the Renewable Fuel Standard? You did. This is an ongoing joke with Mr. Nebraska over here. I am concerned this is the beginning and not the end of political targeting of an industry that is necessary for our economy, public health, and environmental risk management. Indeed, the EPA will be considering several burdensome rulemakings on landfills this year. The agency is currently evaluating multiple rules related to New Source Review to penalize fugitive emissions and require project emissions accounting in major permitting decisions. The waste sector already experiences needless permitting delays for deploying renewable energy projects that the administration supports. These rulemakings will only exacerbate the sector's frequent permitting obstacles, we see this across industries, and aggravate the Biden administration's stated goal of reducing methane emissions. The administration will also need to review its new source performance standards and emission guidelines for municipal solid waste landfills under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act this year. Environmental groups are already petitioning the EPA to set more stringent air emission standards on smaller municipal landfills. There are bipartisan solutions in front of us today. There's broad bipartisan agreement about the difficulties of monitoring and measuring methane emissions from landfills. Development of new technology is underway and is essential to better detect and quantify emissions. Municipal landfills and local communities could benefit from additional support from the EPA to research and evaluate cutting-edge technologies. But none of this will work if outdated regulations like New Source Review stymie those upgrades at existing facilities to recover methane and get it to the market. I urge my colleagues to continue to work with me on permitting reform and updating out-of-date environmental regulations, areas within this committee's jurisdiction, so we can ensure that emissions-reducing technologies can actually get out to the market and make a difference. Thank you again to the three witnesses here today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Senator Capito, thanks for your statement. I want to thank both minority and majority staffs for your work in putting this hearing together. It doesn't just happen by magic, and this is going to be, I think, an especially a valuable hearing, a timely hearing, and we are grateful for our witnesses, but also for our staff in helping to make it happen. Now we're going to turn to our three witnesses. I'm going to take a moment and just to briefly introduce you. And we're grateful again to all of you for helping us better understand and deal with what is an important challenge, but really a great opportunity as well. And we're going to be hearing in this order from these three witnesses, leading off with Mr. Tom Frankowitz. And Tom, subject matter expert, I understand, on waste sector methane at the Rocky Mountain Institute, a research organization known as RMI. In this role, Tom leads RMI's work on methane emissions mitigation in waste management and coordinates the organization's work with the Global Methane Hub. Before joining RMI, Mr. Frankowitz worked in the Climate Change Division in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for over 16 years. He earned his MBA from George Washington University School of Business with a concentration in environmental and strategic management. Welcome. Our second witness is Tia Scarpelli, right? A research scientist and the waste sector lead for Carbon Mapper, a nonprofit organization that uses remote sensing to detect and to quantify methane emissions data. Dr. Scarpelli's research interests include investigating the characteristics of methane emissions at global landfills and dump sites, and the role that satellite observation can play in informing mitigation of waste sector emissions. She earned her PhD in atmospheric chemistry at Harvard University, and she brings a wealth of knowledge on satellite observation and atmospheric modeling. Last but not least, we have Anne Germain, Chief Operating Officer and Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for the National Waste and Recycling Association. She's worked in the field of resource conservation and materials management for more than 30 years and has been with the National Waste and Recycling Association since 2013. Prior to joining the National Waste and Recycling Association, Ms. Germain worked for the Delaware Solid Waste Authority for 19 years, where she served as chief engineer. Where did you live? Did you live in Delaware?
I actually lived in Caroline County, Maryland, while I was there.
Okay, all right. But she is a board certified environmental engineer with a master's in civil engineering from the University of Delaware. And I would just say to my colleagues, about a week ago, I happened to be visiting one of the Delaware solid waste facilities for environmental training, for educational training for students. It's in Dover, and we have thousands of students who come there every year. They learn about the recycling, and actually they learn about what we're talking about here today. And it was just pure joy to be there. And if my Euro colleagues had known that we're going to be with you today, I'm sure they'd all send their best. But we thank you all again for appearing before our committee today. We'll now begin with our witness testimony. Mr. Frankowitz, you're our leadoff hitter. And I want to say, please proceed with your statement when you're ready. Take it away. Thank you. And again, welcome to everybody. And welcome especially to Senator Markey. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Carper. Ranking Member Capito, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I have three...
Can you hold for just a second, Tom? We all serve on different committees. One of my committees, Homeland Security Committee, is meeting right now. They're voting. They need me to come and join you. So I leave you all in good hands right here. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll be back.
So I have three messages for you today. One, landfill methane pollution is a major threat to our climate and communities. We have viable solutions to cut emissions today. And three, implementing these solutions will bring local benefits. Landfills are a major source of methane. Methane has about 80 times the planet heating power of carbon dioxide over a 20-year time period. But thanks to its relatively short atmospheric life, cutting methane today offers an immediate opportunity to slow global warming and is essential to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Each year, we send over 140 million tons of municipal solid waste to roughly 1,200 open landfills across the country. The majority of the waste is organic, think banana peels and yard clippings, generating methane as it decomposes in the landfills. Some landfills capture their gas, but lots of methane still escapes into the atmosphere. In 2021, the methane released from U.S. landfills had the same near-term warming impacts as driving 66 million cars for a year. And the true total is likely higher, as recent aerial surveys suggest. But we have viable solutions to address landfill methane, strengthen landfill emission controls, and reduce organic waste disposal. It's time we modernize air emission regulations for landfills, expanded gas collection, more comprehensive monitoring, and other common sense improvements can limit release of methane to the atmosphere and protect communities from other harmful co-pollutants. At the same time, we must invest in infrastructure to keep organics out of landfills. Waste prevention programs, food rescue, and composting all help to avoid future landfill methane generation and bring other local benefits. On both fronts, we've seen state and local leadership. Strong landfill emission standards in 3 states, organic recycling policies in 9, and curbside composting in hundreds of communities across the country, and new commitments from the private sector as well. But federal action is needed to ensure that methane reductions are achieved at scale. The EPA is statutorily required to revisit its Clean Air Act regulations for landfills this year. The agency should meet the challenge with Section 111 standards that reflect the latest best practices in methane monitoring and control while encouraging organics diversion. Congress can also provide funds to catalyze landfill methane reductions, building on the success of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Additional grant programs could prioritize local waste prevention programs, organic recycling infrastructure, and landfill methane capture. The methane abatement potential here is significant. New EPA landfill standards could reduce emissions by about 1 million metric tons of methane per year, or 80 million metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent. This is based on a preliminary analysis by the Environmental Integrity Project using EPA data. These efforts will help the U.S. meet its domestic climate goals while demonstrating global leadership. A more sustainable waste management system would bring local benefits. Landfills release toxic, smog-forming gases and odors that harm the health and well-being of nearby communities. More effective landfill methane controls would also address these co-pollutants, improving local air quality and life. Keeping organic waste out of landfills can bring further benefits, addressing food insecurity, creating job opportunities, and producing compost to improve soil health. For both stronger landfill emission controls and organics diversion programs, the cumulative benefits exceed the implementation costs. In closing, I'd like to leave you with these 3 points. Landfills are a major source of methane pollution, but we have solutions to reduce these emissions today. And by acting now, through stronger standards, we can limit near-term warming and bring real benefits to communities. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Scarpelli.
Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today. My name is Dr. Tia Scarpelli, and I'm a research scientist and the waste sector lead at Carbon Mapper. Carbon Mapper is a nonprofit organization with a mission to deliver actionable and transparent methane and CO2 emissions data that can be used to inform and accelerate emissions mitigation. Our work to use remote sensing to detect and quantify localized methane emissions is grounded in over a decade of methane research conducted by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, as well as published in science-based literature. I have 3 messages that I'd like to express today. Number 1, that landfills are a major source of methane emissions. Number 2, monitoring technologies show persistent, large emissions at landfills related to specific processes and facility infrastructure. And number 3, advanced monitoring is a critical tool in our current toolbox to guide mitigation and verify emissions reductions. Landfills are an important contributor to U.S. methane emissions. Through aerial surveys conducted since 2016, we have surveyed 300 of over 1,200 open landfills and identified large methane emissions sources at over 200 sites. Over a third of these landfills have been observed emitting more than 1,000 kilograms of methane per hour, with high methane concentrations sometimes extending kilometers in length away from the landfill. Per year, the emissions from this handful of landfills account for 1/4 of the U.S.'s waste sector methane emissions in 2021. Many of these large methane emissions come from 2 main sources. One is the landfill surface, and the other is landfill gas infrastructure. Both can be mitigated using available technologies. These large methane sources often persist for days, months, and even years. For both of these categories, advanced monitoring technologies are readily available to help operators more efficiently monitor methane while also supporting more cost-effective emissions management. There's an opportunity for data-driven methane mitigation at landfills. Remote sensing is an advanced monitoring technique that generates high-resolution images of methane gas. In many cases, we're able to precisely determine where the source is located on the landfill. We have identified some of the highest emitting sources at U.S. landfills, enabling prioritization for mitigation. Studies have also shown discrepancies between observed and reported emissions. This indicates that many of these large, persistent landfill emissions are not included or are misrepresented in traditional emissions accounting methods. Given the dynamic nature of landfills, a routine and comprehensive monitoring system is critical for assessing emissions and verifying mitigation. At the Sunshine Canyon landfill in California, for example, airborne monitoring showed large emissions from surface cover. In collaboration with the operator and local agencies, our observations informed improvements to cover material and the gas capture system, and follow-up monitoring verified that emissions were reduced. There is no single monitoring technology that can see all of the methane at the granularity that's needed at landfills. We need a portfolio of solutions that includes ground-based, aerial, and satellite technologies. Currently, walking surveys are done quarterly at landfills using handheld methane detectors. These traditional surveys only cover a portion of the landfill and do not cover dangerous areas like the landfill workface. This is the area where new waste is added, which means that large emission sources may be missed during the survey. Emerging technologies are already being deployed at landfills, including the use of drones for leak detection and the use of airborne and satellite remote sensing to identify high emitters. With more wide-scale adoption across US landfills, these technologies can enable significant methane reductions. Increased monitoring in itself is not enough. There's an additional need for voluntary action by operators or regulations to address methane leaks once they're identified. In closing, I offer these key takeaways. Number one, remote sensing technologies are making methane emissions visible and can help the waste sector identify large emission sources, improve emission estimates, and support cost-effective emissions management to minimize methane loss in the first place. And number two, landfills are complex systems, and they need comprehensive monitoring that leverages all the tools in our 21st century toolbox, while giving operators flexibility to choose cost-effective methods that maximize mitigation potential or return on investment. I want to thank the committee for their work and the opportunity to share this research with you today, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, and I apologize, I left the doctor part out of your first name, so.
No problem.
Your address, so I apologize for that. Ms. Germain.
Thank you. Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to testify today on opportunities to avoid, detect, and reduce landfill methane emissions. My name is Ann Germain, and I serve as the Chief Operating Officer and Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at the National Waste and Recycling Association. We are a trade association representing the private sector waste and recycling industry. Landfills protect the environment by responsibly managing society's wastes. Our sector is subject to extensive federal, state, and local requirements, including stringent design, operating, monitoring, closure, and post-closure standards established under RCRA, as well as landfill gas collection and control requirements under the Clean Air Act. Besides these regulatory obligations, we have made significant advancements in landfill gas capture and control systems that meet or exceed our regulatory requirements. We also closely monitor emissions from our landfills and engage in corrective actions swiftly and efficiently. We are actively deploying infrastructure that transforms yesterday's waste into renewable energy, which can power communities, fuel vehicles, and support progress in offsetting the impacts of climate change. Recently, a narrative has emerged that air emissions from landfills have increased. Based on data from the EPA, however, municipal solid waste landfills air emissions have declined by nearly 45% between 1990 and 2021. All the while, landfill waste volumes have increased by about 5% over that same period. We are proud of this progress, and we are not aware of any other industry that has achieved even remotely comparable improvements. However, we are committed to reducing climate impacts even further, consistent with the goals of the Global Methane Pledge and the administration's commitment to reduce methane emissions from the waste sector by at least 15% by 2030. Achieving these goals necessitates the development of more accurate measurement and measurement methods to quantify emissions. Our members are actively assessing how various aerial and ground-based methane emission measurement methods developed for other sectors can be applied to landfills. Translating direct measurements to quantification of landfill methane is challenging because landfill emissions fluctuate frequently, sometimes even daily. It's influenced by the age and quantity of waste that's in place, the waste composition, the cover type and location, landfill gas operations, waste placement activities, and even the weather. These dynamic conditions impact modeling assumptions and drive emissions estimates. Aerial emissions monitoring is gaining attention and encompasses a variety of technologies, including satellite imagery, aerial flights, and drones. Aerial emission monitoring, however, has limitation as it is not continuous and only captures moments in time when emissions may be temporarily higher or lower than normal. One area where aerial monitoring and on-ground sampling can be used for immediate benefit is in identifying the location and concentration of any emissions. This enables site operators to take immediate action to investigate and correct suspected leaks. Further work will be necessary before these technologies, however, can be used to calculate landfill methane emissions accurately. And we would all benefit from additional funding to support the acceleration and progress around emissions monitoring, calculations, and reporting. The oil and gas industry and agriculture industries have benefited from substantially greater levels of funding for their methane emissions reductions research and development in comparison to the solid waste sector. And we recommend that Congress recognize this disparity as EPA moves forward with rulemaking on landfills. We also wish to highlight certain policies that, if addressed, could incentivize landfills to capture greater amounts of landfill methane beyond mandated requirements. Of immediate consequences is the Department of Treasury's proposed rule on the expanded investment tax credit for qualified biogas property under the Inflation Reduction Act. Our sector worked hard to advocate for this tax credit and has relied on its availability in planning multi-billion-dollar investments in biogas processing infrastructure. So we were surprised by Treasury's recent proposal to virtually eliminate landfill biogas processing facilities from credit eligibility, which would in turn disincentivize methane abatement solution within our sector. We therefore ask your support in requesting that Treasury reverse course and return to Congress's initial goal of driving economy-wide investments consistent with the administration's climate objectives. The landfill sector is also facing other threats to its plans to invest in technology and detect and capture landfill emissions. For example, although landfills are incentivized to capture methane emissions through EPA's Renewable Fuel Standard program, the agency has received a petition to revisit the annual standards that it recently finalized. Granting the petition would disrupt the long-term stability needed for continued investment in landfill gas collection and renewable energy programs. Overcoming challenges such as this are among the most significant regulatory opportunities available to EPA to incentivize landfill operators to make capital investments in beneficial use infrastructure and capture greater levels of methane emissions, thereby supporting broader climate solutions and public policy objectives. We acknowledge the action to address climate crisis is necessary, and we look forward to working with Congress, the administration, and other stakeholders in evaluating meaningful policy solutions to capture greater amounts of methane that result from our industry's provision of necessary and vital public services. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee and look forward to any questions.
Thank you. Thank all three of you. And in the absence of our chairman, I will take my license and begin to ask the questions. Mr. Maine, I addressed in my opening statement some of the concerns from small municipal landfills. Just give me a lay of the land here. Just what's the percent, if you looked at the whole numbers of landfills, what numbers of those are municipal, percentage-wise, approximately?
So it's about 50-50.
50-50.
Tom said that there's about 1,200 landfills in the country. About half of them are publicly owned and about half of them are privately owned. If you look at the volume of material going into the landfills, however, it switches. About 2/3 of the waste goes to privately owned landfills and about 1/3 goes to publicly owned landfills. Okay. So that shows you basically that the publicly owned landfills are significantly smaller than privately owned.
Okay, so let's get into the what kind of, and we've heard a lot about some of the development of technologies of capturing, not just capturing, but also measuring and monitoring what kind of challenges would that bring to a small municipal landfill? Are they already doing it if they are complying with the EPA regulations, which I'm sure they would want to do?
Right, so the NSPS does have size limitations, so landfills below a certain size threshold are not subject to the new source performance standards. So only so many of the smaller landfills may not be subject to those rules at all. And so changing the rules to focus on extending it to smaller landfills would, of course, subject them to control and capture requirements that they might not currently be doing.
Okay. Okay, Tom, let me ask you a question back to my first question. Percentage-wise, kind of the lay of the land, then if you looked at total emissions going out from the, what you said, 1,200 landfills, are more of them going out from the, are the emissions equivalent? You see what I'm trying to ask? Are the emissions more at the smaller municipals, or because maybe they haven't made the provisions? Can you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, on that exact percentage, I'd have to get back to you.
Well, no, it doesn't
on-
have to be exact.
Yeah, no, I can't speak to which percent has higher emissions, but, I can, just following up on, in terms of like the types of technology for controls, things like gas collection, improved cover, best practices for operations and maintenance, the types of things that are required between gas collection and monitoring for the NSPS, are generally tried and true technology. So those technologies for controlling emissions at a site are not new technology and are
Right.
deployed both at municipal and private landfills.
Right, and I mean, they're obviously all at a cost, and I think that's in a lot of different ways. Is there an economic, and I'll go back to you, is there an economic incentive in capturing and selling methane, and what are some of the regulatory obstacles to that?
So it's very much dependent on the type of facility. So if you have, right now, the Section 48 tax credits that I referred to and the
Right.
RFS do provide some incentives for capturing outside of the regulation and then basically utilizing. Depending on the landfill's location, they might be able to utilize the gas in some way, but many of them would want to many of them do not have any access to be able to create some energy from the gas, so they would have to make it pipeline quality. And currently, the way the Section 48 tax credit regulations are written by Treasury, they would disqualify gas upgrading equipment necessary to make it pipeline quality.
Okay, Senator Ricketts?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to enter a letter from the American Biogas Council which outlines their concerns and implications with the Inflation Reduction Act's Section 48, just referenced here, expansion to include biogas as an eligible technology and the exclusion of cleaning and conditioning equipment.
Without objection.
I'll send that over. Great. Nebraska has tremendous examples of utilizing methane from landfills to generate renewable energy. For over 20 years, the Elk City Station in Douglas County has utilized methane from a local landfill, and that's about a 6-megawatt project. In 2014, the City of Lincoln and Lincoln Electric System have partnered on a landfill gas to energy project, to harness the methane gas produced in the City of Lincoln's Bluff Road landfill, and that's about a 4.8 megawatt project. The City of Lincoln utilizes about 80 megawatts annually, and so this is a great way to diversify their energy generation. But landfills are not the only opportunity. Our livestock producers are increasingly working toward capturing methane from their facilities to use for energy generation. The federal government needs to continue to support voluntary emissions reductions technologies that make sense for communities and producers and not penalize our critical utilities. Now, we talked about, you mentioned Section 48, Mr. Germain. Section 48 of the IRS Code now provides for an investment tax credit to turn raw biogas captured from landfills and of high importance to my state, created from animal and crop waste at farms and feedlots and food processing facilities into useful fuel. And in fact, Nebraska has 3 times as many cattle as it does people. So this is kind of a big deal for us. We are the beef state. This new provision targets biogas that is sold or otherwise used productively and excludes disposing of the raw biogas by burning it. The new language also adds that cleaning and conditioning equipment is covered by the new investment tax credit. This addition is vital since raw biogas created from a farm or feedlot, anaerobic digester, or collected from a landfill without cleaning and conditioning, as already pointed out, cannot be used in commercial fuel, put in a pipeline, or stored. It essentially must be burned on site, and of course, that is the very outcome the new provision is trying to avoid. Foolishly, the Department of Treasury last month issued proposed rules for biogas investment tax credit that inexplicably exclude the cleaning and conditioning equipment necessary to upgrade raw biogas so that it can be stored, transported, and used as renewable fuel. Treasury is proposing to deny this tax credit to biogas cleaning and conditioning equipment needed to take the raw biogas and turn it into pipeline-quality biomethane. This equipment is typically the most expensive part of turning raw landfill gas or raw biogas created from farm digesters into useful renewable product envisioned by the amendments to Section 48. Without the support, many projects to transform waste biogas into valuable renewable fuel will be uneconomical, especially at those small and rural landfills. And I would also point out the administration is constantly doing things that are counter to the goal of reducing the impact to the environment. For example, since you mentioned the Renewable Fuels Act, or Renewable Fuel Standard, they set RVOs, for example, for biodiesel and renewable diesel below the industry's ability to actually produce that, what we're currently producing right now, thus creating havoc in that marketplace. They also flex fuel vehicles, which burn higher percentages of ethanol, reduce the impact on the environment. They don't get the same tax credits as EVs and so forth. So we're constantly seeing that. Anyway, Ms. Germain, do you agree that without incentives for biogas cleanup equipment, many landfills will have an economic challenge in investing into the necessary and expensive equipment needed to process raw landfill gas into a commercial renewable gas?
Yes, we definitely agree with that. That's one of the reasons why we submitted a letter to Treasury about changing the definition of qualified biogas property.
Great. In other words, the administration's strained interpretation of the new biogas provisions will in fact strand this valuable fuel because it cannot be moved off-site and to homes, businesses, and industry that would welcome and pay for a premium for renewable natural gas or advanced electrical technologies. Ms. Germain, do you agree that to ensure these waste streams can contribute to the nation's energy needs, anaerobic digesters must be coupled with biogas upgrading equipment to turn raw biogas into a useful commercial fuel?
The viability of anaerobic digesters are dependent on being able to utilize credits that will incentivize those facilities to be able to be developed. And we need the infrastructure if we're going to be looking at increased biogas production from anaerobic digesters.
Since the administration is denying the investment tax credit to the key equipment to allow digester systems to create a useful or lucrative energy product, do you agree that the administration's position will result in fewer digesters being built and therefore more organic material ending up in landfills?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Thank you for chairing. How's it going? You know, we all serve on different committees, and sometimes we're needed to be in 2 or 3 places at once. So thanks for bearing with me, and thank you, Senator Capito. I'm going to ask a question now for Dr. Scarpelli. This deals with uncovering landfill emissions. One of the reasons we know the scale of methane emissions from landfills is thanks to the extensive work that's done by researchers using NASA technology to detect and to quantify these emissions. For example, Dr. Scarpelli, your organization conducted, I'm told, aerial surveys looking for methane sources in California and found that certain landfills were the largest observed emissions sources. My question is, please describe for us how Carbon Mapper adapted this new technology for the purposes of detecting emissions, and talk with us, share with us some of the results of your studies that your organization and others have produced.
Thank you for the question, Senator. Thank you for the comments about the history of the technology. Carbon Mapper the technology we use was originally developed at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and we still interact with NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in a couple different ways. As you mentioned, the aerial technology that we use, includes the Avris NG, which is an aircraft that was designed.
Say that again, the what?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
You said something G.
Oh, it's Avris NG. It's the name of the aircraft. It's a NASA JPL aircraft, and that's what we fly.
JPL.
Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Thank you.
And so that's one of the aircrafts that we fly. It has what we call an imaging spectrometer is the instrument on board. And that's also on the NASA EMIT instrument on the International Space Station is also an imaging spectrometer. That's the technology that we use. When we go and fly an aerial campaign, we work with the stakeholders as well. And so that's what we're trying to extend, not just to develop the technology for research purposes, but also engage with the people that can use the data on the ground. And then we're also part of a broader coalition of partners that includes NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory and our commercial partner, Planet Labs, and other partners. And this is part of a broader coalition to launch satellites. And these satellites are actually developed originally a new generation of these imaging spectrometers. And that the idea there is that eventually we would have a satellite constellation that could do biweekly to daily revisits of sites globally across the world. And then we would the Carbon Mapper's goal is to get that data into the hands of people on the ground who can use it. And we've had positive experiences, including in the state of California, where we've worked with stakeholders to get the information to the operators so they can take voluntary action to mitigate emissions.
I want you to go back in what you just said and compress it into one paragraph and just dumb it down. Just make it just very as clear as you can, please. Go ahead.
Okay.
Sometimes I say, how would you explain this to your grandmother, or your grandfather? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think the phrase we like to use is that you can't manage what you don't measure.
Yep, I've used that
for
a few
methane.
times. Yeah.
So
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Yeah,
Again.
it's very accurate, I think, and it applies to landfills, is that our goal is mitigation, and when at landfills you can use it for beneficial use as well, and so anything that we can provide with these technologies to increase gas capture and to reduce leaks is what our goal is, and so really the key there is these technologies can provide technical assistance to operators, and so we just want to provide and get that into jurisdictions that maybe can't, afford an aerial campaign on their own. So satellites, because they have this routine monitoring, provide that opportunity.
All right. Well, let me follow up with that. How do you validate the results of the satellite and the aerial surveys? In other words, how do we know whether the results actually quantify the observed methane emissions?
We've participated with the technology in various what we call controlled release experiments. These are validation studies where you release a known amount of methane and then different technologies can observe that release. And then you try to, you estimate it using your own processing steps. And then you compare to the known amount of methane that's being released and see if you can produce back that.
When you say you, who is you?
So this would be like Carbon Mapper would participate with, an aircraft instrument, or you can also have different technologies all participate at the same time. Some of these are in the private sector, some of these are academic institutions, and the idea there is that we don't know the known release, and we've seen that in these experiments we are able to reproduce the known release rates of methane.
All right, thank you. Senator Mark, you're welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In Massachusetts, we have a rule that any business or organization that generates more than half a ton of food waste a week can't put all that food in the garbage. The ban has not only reduced greenhouse gas emissions, but also saved space by keeping millions of pounds of food out of landfills. Thousands of Massachusetts businesses have begun donating unused food to shelters and to food banks across the state. Our state's food waste rule accomplished this win-win scenario while also creating over 500 jobs and generating $175 million in economic benefits during its first 2 years. So, Mr. Frankowitz, can you elaborate on the community and economic benefits that organic waste prevention and organics recycling programs have had across the country?
Thank you, Senator Markey, and excellent question. We really look at organics diversion and landfill gas control as being a two-pronged approach, and I know sometimes it might seem odd to talk about these two different things at one time, but you're basically, working upstream and downstream to reduce landfill gas emissions. And when it comes to organics diversion and food loss, food waste prevention, there's really, I think, several significant benefits. And of course, you have the climate benefit, which is global. Generally speaking, for every 6,000 tons of methane, there's 6,000 tons of methane that's avoided for every 1 million tons of food waste that's diverted.
So is Massachusetts' program a model?
It's definitely a great example of a state taking...
That's a leading question.
Thank you.
Strike that one from the record.
Your Honor, I'm going to bring that up on appeal.
It's a great example of a state taking proactive action that both has global benefits with methane reductions, but most of those benefits are actually experienced locally. On average, Americans spend $1,300 a year for groceries that is just wasted. And so by avoiding that food loss, food waste, Americans are saving money on their monthly grocery bills.
No, yeah, absolutely, that's great. And by the way, Delaware is the first state, but not in everything. Okay, we want Massachusetts is first in something. Maybe here, Mr. Frankowitz, what role can the EPA play in scaling up similar organic waste prevention and recycling programs nationwide? What's the recommendation to the EPA that you have?
Yeah, so as you know, or as you may know, EPA has done a lot of great work researching both the methane impacts from food loss, food waste, but also the community benefits. They currently have a strategy out right now that's out for comment. But EPA has shown great guidance in terms of researching best practices for this. But really, this is something that is often implemented at the local level, at the community level, at the state level. There's a lot that can be done in terms of grant support and also technical capacity. There's grants out right now, the Swiffer grants, that are supporting communities and implementing programs, but there's still a lot that can be done in terms of developing best practices and capacity building and technical assistance, because money's part of it.
We'll work with the EPA on that.
Yeah.
That sounds like a great recommendation. Landfill operators in Massachusetts, like New Bedford's Landfill Gas to Energy project, are showing that gas collection and monitoring systems are a cost-effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And Loci Controls, a startup founded by 2 MIT alumni in Cambridge, has developed low-cost lunchbox-sized sensors that have reduced landfill emissions by 4 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in just a few years. These Massachusetts projects and technologies prove it is feasible to do better than the status quo. So, Mr. Frankowitz, again, what are some of the simple strategies that all landfill operators could use to reduce their methane emissions today?
Yeah, Senator Markey, I'm glad you brought this up. When you talk about the cost of different technologies, not only are many of these technologies tried and true, right, like having gas collection, operation practices for soil cover, improving working face, like having a smaller, tighter working face, but when it comes to gas collection and the relationship to energy projects, that is, what you call a win-win solution, because generally using this improved technology for automated well tuning, where currently it's typically done manually, you generally see recovery improvements of 10 to 20%. And so that increased recovery of methane is increased revenue for an energy project and often pays for the cost of that collection system in about a year.
And it would also reduce odors as well.
Yeah, that is something I think that, we talk about odors, we talk about methane, we talk about toxics. Landfill gas, it's a stew of different, of carbon dioxide and water, hydrogen sulfide, smog-forming compounds. So when you reduce methane, you're reducing all those other things as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Frankowitz. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep, thanks for those questions. Senator Cardin, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. Well, before Senator Markey leaves, let me just quote from Maryland Code Environmental, Article 9, Section 1724.1, our Maryland law. Any person, business, or cafeteria that produces more than 2 tons of food residual in a given week must ensure organic waste is separate and diverted from landfills. So I just want you to know Maryland is very much in the forefront here. Senator Carper joined me in a visit to the organic recycling facilities that we have in the state of Maryland that operate efficiently in producing energy and producing safe fertilizer materials from organic waste. So I just wanted to underscore the point that Senator Markey has made. Landfills produce a lot of methane emissions, and we can do a better job in keeping things out of landfills. So thank you for your leadership on that issue in Massachusetts, but we want you to know that Maryland and Massachusetts have more in common than just the first letter of our name. So let me also just point out the fact, which is pretty obvious, and that is, in my state of Maryland, landfills represent 40% of our methane emissions. That's a large amount. And the other issue here, Mr. Chairman, that I think is very important, and I want to compliment our chairman and ranking member. We've done a lot on methane emissions reductions, and thank you for what you have done and the leadership on this committee. Very instrumental in the bipartisan infrastructure package and the other bills that we've been able to pass, including the Inflation Reduction Act, that have dealt with methane reductions. And I think we have a proud record in this committee. But this is also a matter of environmental justice. I know where landfills are located. These are traditionally underserved communities, and they pay a heavier price because of the location of the landfill. Anything we can do to mitigate the damages caused by landfills or reduce the amount of material that needs to go into landfills help communities that have traditionally been underserved. So in my state, we have taken major steps. We have a strong regulatory system in regards to landfills. We do covering issues. We do a lot to mitigate the impact of landfills. I guess my question is to the panel is, we see states are doing good things. Is there a way that we can have stronger federal policies that partner with the states, giving them the incentives they need in order to take more aggressive action to prevent the negative impacts of landfills, and as it relates not only to methane emissions, but to the other concerns that are raised? But why don't we just go right on down the line?
Sure. And Senator Cardin, I want to commend Maryland on their efforts to lead both on, one thing with Maryland and Washington State, both, they've taken this dual-pronged approach of increasing stringency of landfill gas regulations while encouraging organics diversion, and that's really the kind of best way to do these things. You mentioned landfills as an environmental justice issue, and I think that's an important point. More than half landfills are located within a mile of disadvantaged communities. I think that's also a reason, while some states have shown leadership in moving forward on these programs, that's not all have, and that's where you really need strong federal standards, both for increased landfill gas control, because as I mentioned, when you reduce landfill gas emissions, you're also reducing toxins, smog-forming pollution, and odor, but also there's more that the federal government can do to support organics diversion and treatment, and that's really where you see some of the greatest community benefits as well, both in terms of avoided food loss and waste, right, that impacts people's budgets, but also composting and composting facilities, generally speaking, create 6 jobs for every 2 and 1 job that's created for landfilling and incineration, respectively.
Thank you. Dr. Scarpelli?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I mean, we've heard here today that reducing methane emissions can help with community benefits, both in terms of odor and community health, because there's often the pollutants co-emitted with the methane. And speaking from a monitoring perspective, we've seen that these monitoring technologies can help find leaks and mitigate them quicker. In terms of federal programs, I think the key here is we need to scale up the use of these technologies, and so having public-funded grants that are competitive for the technologies to be scaled up. And so providing jurisdictions with access to those technologies and that technical assistance in jurisdictions where they wouldn't necessarily be able to get that on their own. And I think that from a monitoring perspective would really be key.
I have a very generous chairman. I'm sure he'd give me an extra few minutes, Ms. Germain, if you would like to make a response.
Senator's time has expired. No, not really. Go ahead.
Sure. So one of the things to recognize when we're looking at some of these food waste diversion is to understand that we currently, the infrastructure that's in place for composting and anaerobic digestion facilities, there's just not enough of them to be able to take all the potentially diverted materials. So we need to focus on what we can do to improve that infrastructure. And also to focus on the quality of the materials. One of the things some of our members own and operate anaerobic digestion and composting facilities, and just like you're probably already aware with recycling, we're dealing with a lot of contamination in our composting and our anaerobic digestion facilities, and we want to make a viable product that can be utilized as a soil amendment, and in order to do that, we need to ensure that we have high-quality material that isn't contaminated with material that doesn't belong in there. We know that a lot of manufacturers are trying to take food contact packaging and claim that it is compostable, but yet a lot of those so-called compostable packaging really doesn't compost in our systems. And so it requires extra steps and a lot of effort to try and remove it to make a clean-looking product. So we are recommending to EPA as part of our comments to their organic strategy that they really require not just lab standards, but field testing of any packaging that claims compostability, and that there should be some standardization on labeling before people can claim that their products and packaging can be composted.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Carter. Thanks for your faithful attendance here and for helping to lead a good fight. I think a couple of other senators, I think, are on their way trying to get here, and from other assignments. And one of them is Senator Merkley. And before he gets here, I'm going to ask another question or two, and when he shows up, we'll recognize him. With that, Mr. Frankowitz, I know you have talked about the interplay between efforts at the state and the federal levels to reduce methane emissions from landfills. And you mentioned, I believe in your testimony, that EPA is required to revisit the Clean Air Act's section, I think it's 111, standards for municipal solid waste landfills in August of this year. Is it August of this year? I think it is. That's a question. Yeah. Yeah. All right, take my word for it. It's August of this year. Let me ask a couple of...
I believe it's August, but I might have to get back to you.
There you go, all right.
Okay.
Let me ask a couple of questions that I think follow up your conversation with Senator Markey. Would you please expand on how both organic waste diversion and EPA's methane emission regulations work together to reduce the methane emissions associated with landfills?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Senator Carper. That's an excellent question. As I mentioned earlier, I think Dr. Scarpelli and I have both mentioned this two-pronged approach, and that's because, the methane, it comes from the organic matter that decomposes in the landfill. So once it's there, the way to control it is with gas collection systems, this system of wells and blowers that suck up the landfill gas and typically burn it then in a flare. But the best way to control landfill gas emissions ultimately is to keep those organics out of the landfill. But once they're in there, they can decompose, creating methane for up to 50 years. So it's not really a matter of doing one or the other. You really have to do both, and that's why states that have kind of taken a two-pronged approach is a really practical way to do this. But implementation has been uneven, and so really the best way to have a comprehensive approach is for EPA to take on both revisiting its landfill gas standards, the Section 111 standards that you mentioned this summer, but also really leaning into organics diversion in parallel.
Okay. We've been joined by, not by Senator Merkley, but by Senator Whitehouse. We're happy to turn it over to you. I think I've asked questions. Senator Capito's asked her questions, but if you're ready, I'll be happy, Senator Whitehouse, to recognize you.
Thank you very kindly.
Yeah, welcome.
I crossed
Glad to hear.
Senator Merkley, headed to my budget hearing. Everybody's got a lot going on today, but I'm grateful for this hearing. I appreciate the witnesses being here. Dr. Scarpelli, let me ask you particularly about the methane tracking and spotting technology that is out there now that we have satellites that can detect methane leaks and geolocate with great precision the sources of those leaks. Is there anything about a landfill that makes it harder to detect by satellite than, say, a gas pipeline leak?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Landfills are complex engineered systems, and so one of the main differences in terms of detecting leaks is that it's a large area and there are many potential points that leaks could be coming from, whereas in an oil and gas well, there's specific infrastructure that are the leak points. And so that's why it's really key to have comprehensive monitoring. You want to be able to see across the facility, or also at the, there is gas facilities that are maybe capturing the gas and sending it to pipeline. You can have leaks, across different surfaces of the landfill, the actual wells collecting it on the landfill. And so there are all of these potential sources across a large area. So it's really important to, map that whole area for potential leaks.
But you can at least identify that the leak is happening and then turn to more ground-based detectors to figure out which kind of a leak it is if you're looking at a leaking landfill.
Yes, and then that's why I think it's key to have a combination of technologies. Some are better at that really high accuracy, where is the leak coming from, versus the remote sensing technology. The really key there is that we're seeing the large sources, and so in terms of prioritizing, we want to get the biggest ones first to get the most return on our investment in mitigation.
Yep.
And so it really helps prioritize, and let's get those big ones first, and then we'll move on to the smaller leaks.
Yeah. Do you know what the current status is with the EPA folks about having regular and reliable access to satellite methane leak data?
I can't speak to EPA regulations. I know there are these funding to look into these different technologies, and the way that we can best combine them to get the most comprehensive view of the sites. And we have seen that these technologies work, that we can identify leaks and it helps operators mitigate. That's been our experience.
Well, here's what I think is happening, and that is that EPA has systematically undercounted methane leaks for a very long time. EDF has done a far better job of tracking methane leakage, a private organization, and EDF thinks that its numbers are actually low because there are some technical issues with trying to do really complete tracking, but with the advent of better satellite methane leak imaging, that can all be resolved. But EPA, having done this poorly for a very, very long time, it's my understanding, has no direct contractual relationship with any satellite providing entity so that it can deploy its efforts when a large methane leak appears, which is, to me, a little bit like the fire department not tracking where smoke is pouring out of buildings and going to respond to the problem. I just don't know why that hasn't happened yet. It seems like it's an incredibly obvious thing when the technology is out there to access the technology. I understand that NASA has acquired a good deal of technology and that some entities make it available for free, but maybe not for free and immediately at the same time. And obviously, if you're dealing with a leak, immediately is a pretty good value to be able to provide. So we're hoping that the methane leak task force that has been set up will get access to that technology before too long so that we can treat a methane leak properly, not just score that it happened months later or react after it's been spilling for weeks and weeks, but to have on-time information that causes environmental protection officials or even local lawyers or the mayor, I don't care whom, to know that there's a methane leak going on in real time and in real time respond and try to get it shut down. It just seems unbelievably sloppy to not have that system in place. So we are counting on that methane task force to cure those disabilities, those self-imposed disabilities that have been bedeviling EPA. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Thanks for your vigilance and continued involvement in this issue. I know it comes from
It's
the
their vigilance that is where the issue is.
Yes, yes, yes.
Senator Carper, may I add to that? Is that
Well, I don't know.
possible?
No, all right, go ahead.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse, thank you for raising that point. And there's been a lot of discussion on technology, and the satellites are pretty amazing, but the technology doesn't make the data available, and that's something that's really up for both state, local, and federal governments to do. Carbon Mapper is one of the few organizations that makes all their data available, but for years now, companies have been availing themselves of private satellite data to better inform their operations, but there's no obligation to make that data available. So that's one thing we'd really like to see, both at a state and federal level, that in addition to this advanced monitoring, making sure that it's available in a timely way, because emissions transparency is just as important as the technology.
And just to be clear, I'm told that the federal government is now in procurement mode with regards to acquiring access to real-time leak detection services. January of 2024, now in procurement mode with respect to acquiring access to these services. That kind of speaks for itself.
All right. We've been joined by Senator Padilla. Senator Padilla, good to see you. How are you doing? Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Something that if I've spoken on it in committee before, it's been a while, Mr. Chairman, but not sure if you knew that when I grew up, we lived not too far from a landfill. And I can attest
Where
to
was that?
that,
Where was that?
in the city of Los Angeles, the northeast corner of the San Fernando Valley, the once upon a time infamous Lopez Canyon landfill, to be precise, owned and operated by the city of Los Angeles. And I share that to establish that when I say that living near landfill is beyond just an annoyance, I speak from real world experience. It's in many ways a threat to our health, public health, individual health. It also prompted, Mr. Chairman, my environmental activism, because my mom, along with a group of neighbors and community leaders, would bring kids out to protest for the closure of the landfill. This was back when I was in high school. We bore the brunt of what landfills mean in all the communities in which they're located. Too often it's soil contamination, water impacts, diesel trucks driving through neighborhoods, emitting toxic exhaust, and on and on and on. In California, this is where I want to talk about equity for a second, people of color are more than twice as likely to live within a mile of a landfill compared to the rest of the population. So, Mr. Frankowitz, can you discuss the health impacts of landfill emissions on nearby communities?
Thank you for raising that really important point, because as important as the climate challenge is, the impacts of air pollution are felt on a daily basis. I had mentioned earlier that landfill gases, it's a mix of a number of gases, so it's methane, water, carbon dioxide, but it's also a long list of hazardous air pollutants, and also smog forming, ozone pollution. and those are immediately felt by the local community. And so when we talk about controlling methane or even enhanced methane recovery, what we're really talking about is reducing the amount of air pollution that's affecting local communities. And one thing I'll add to that, some of the strategies to improve gas collection, like automated well tuning, better cover, leak detection, these are things that have a direct impact on safety as well. So one of the things that can be caused by an improperly controlled landfill gas collection system is intrusion of oxygen, and that's one thing that causes landfill fires. So when you operate better, recover more gas, and operate better a landfill gas collection system, you're reducing pollution and drastically improving safety.
And we know, as far as we've come in the last generation or two, between liners to protect soil, groundwater, and gas collection systems, to your own point, we still have a lot more work to do. I mean, just yesterday, the Los Angeles Times reported, quote, rivers of odorous waste, end quote, erupting like a geyser from the Chiquita Canyon landfill in Southern California. Carcinogens like benzene were 8 times higher than the state's health limit, but these results weren't shared with the public for weeks. So to your point, Mr. Frankowitz, how can EPA provide closer to real-time information on air quality to the public to protect public health?
Yeah, I think this again comes down to emissions transparency, because the technology on its own, it doesn't put the information in the hands of people for action. So there's actions that EPA could take, both in terms of grants and also provide funding, and this would likely be within Congress's power to provide funding for both the satellites, but also making that data available. There is some lag time for processing that data, but I think of EPA's Air Now portal, because there's been a system of air monitors around the country for years, but it wasn't until Air Now and the Air Quality Index that information became accessible to citizens. So I think something of that nature would really empower local citizens.
Great. Now I want to connect some dots between monitoring, mapping, and remote sensing. I'm pleased to see a witness today with the Carbon Mapper Project, which partners with JPL based in California, a facility I'm particularly proud of. Their satellite will build off of JPL's EMIT instrument, which was launched in 2022 and is currently operating on the International Space Station. Now, although EMIT, Mr. Chairman, was designed to measure dust, it's proven to also detect methane from landfills around the world at high spatial resolution. Dr. Scarpelli, can you elaborate on how Carbon Mapper's project builds on JPL technology for methane detection from space?
Thank you for that question, Senator. So as you mentioned, these technologies are kind of building off of each other, and for the different, so NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory has airborne instruments, and as well as they have the NASA EMIT instrument that you mentioned that's on the International Space Station, and our satellites will be the next generation, and they have different capabilities. So the idea here is that we're seeing high emission sources, and we're getting that information into the hands of the operators on the ground who can take action to mitigate, and we can provide the location of those sources, and so the operators know where to look on the ground. And these are seeing, if we can see it, that means it's pretty big. Seeing it from space as well, that means it's pretty large. This ranges from 10 kilograms of methane per hour to hundreds to thousands of kilograms of methane per hour. And as you mentioned, these can impact community health. We see methane plumes from the landfills that overlap surrounding communities. And so being able to take that technology and get it into the hands of operator to achieve quick mitigation will really benefit the local communities.
Thank you very much. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thanks so much for joining us. My colleague knows my wife and I have a son who lives out in California, lives in the Bay Area, and every now and then when we're on a recess here, I go out to California and I visit technology companies to find folks who are doing things that are relevant to our jurisdiction as a committee. And a year or two ago, 3 years ago, I visited a company which was taking cow manure and food waste and anaerobic digesters and creating if you will, fuel for buses and trucks and all. And if you fly into the San Francisco airport, you'll notice I think they do a better job on separating just trash, stuff that's not recyclable, with recyclables and with food waste. They do a great job. You go throughout the SFO airport, and they have these 3 containers all throughout the airport facility, and they do a good job. California has, as my colleague knows, a lot of cows, and they produce a lot of cow manure. In Delaware, we have some cows, but we really have a lot of chickens. And for every person in Delaware, I think there's close to 300 chickens. So we sort of using the model that you've pioneered in California. Delmarva, which includes Delaware and Maryland, Senator Cardin, have been using the same technology, different source of fuel, not cows, but chickens, and it works pretty darn well. So I like to say one of the greatest, if you will, compliments we can pay is copying what others are doing and hopefully making it at least as good, maybe better. We'll see. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Merkley is on his way. He's going to join us. And while he's on his way, I'm going to ask a couple more questions. And one of those, first one is sort of go back with Dr. Scarpelli and touch on something we talked about a little bit earlier. And then, Mr. Maine, I have a question or two for you. Dr. Scarpelli, how can deploying comprehensive monitoring provide benefits for both landfill operators and the local communities?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think I'll split that into operators and communities. Speaking to local communities, we've mentioned that these large methane sources can have co-emitted pollutants along with them. So by addressing the methane sources quickly, we're also reducing that co-emission of the pollutant. In addition, we've seen in examples like for the Sunshine Canyon landfill in California, for example, where by mitigating the methane, we also see a reduction in the number of odor complaints from the surrounding community at the landfill. And then speaking to benefits to operators, the key here is we want to capture more methane, and so if they have beneficial use at the site, this means more return on investment for the operator. And we see it as it's technical assistance that the operators can take advantage of to go out and find the leak and fix it as quick as possible. Because landfills are complex, so knowing where to look on the landfill of where the leak is it's not an easy task. And sometimes mitigation is it's an engineering design, and so verifying that once you've made a change, the emissions actually were reduced is also incredibly important and useful to the operator.
All right, thank you. Mr. Maine, and I'll probably ask Mr. Frankowitz to join you in answering those questions too, but I want to lead off with you if we could. In addition to methane, landfill gas contains, as we've heard here today, hazardous air pollutants, odors, and other dangerous gases. They impact air quality, they impact health, they impact our quality of life for neighboring communities, many of which are already vulnerable anyway. Mr. Germain, your organization is a national leader in landfill management and policy and has a unique perspective in the community impacts related to this pollution. I oftentimes, my colleagues would bear this out, but I oftentimes use the phrase, find out what works and do more of that. And what we're trying to do is, a little bit of that is we address this problem, this challenge, but I think this opportunity. So question, would you share an example or two of government or maybe corporate policies that are helping to reduce methane emissions from landfills through gas capture or organics diversion?
Sure. So one of the things that we've seen a lot of our members have made sustainability commitments. They've made them publicly. And so from a corporate initiative, looking at some of those corporate policies where they've made those sustainability commitments, that encompasses methane reductions. And so we collectively have been looking at a lot of the technologies that have been discussed already, not just satellite, but also aerial, drone, ground-based. In fact, recently, collectively, we worked to, as an industry, to do a controlled release and tested out 14 different technologies. So there's a tremendous number of different technologies out there. Which one is the right one? Which one is best? Are they all good? We're not sure. We haven't had the opportunity to really explore that. Our efforts to EPA has not had the funding to be able to conduct some of this research. So the industry collectively conducted some of this research back in November. We've just got the results in earlier this year, and we anticipate presenting it at a conference at the end of February. But this will give us additional information on which of the technologies will be most useful so that we can utilize that going forward in our efforts to use best practices in reducing our methane emissions from our sites.
Good. I don't know if either of other witnesses would like to add to that or add their thoughts on that last question, but the question was asking Mr. Maine to share an example or two of government or corporate policies that are helping to reduce methane emissions from landfills through gas capture, organics, diversion. Would either of you want to add to that?
I would like to add something to that.
Sure.
I would just want to reiterate the importance of doing these controlled release experiments. This really does help technologies both determine, improve their own methodologies and, validate the technology. And, one of the important things is that I know it's not easy to do a controlled release, and we're seeing these very large emission sources from some landfills. And so being able to release accurate and amount of methane that reflects that, so that the technologies can really be tested on those large releases is really important.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Germain, go ahead.
Yeah, so and thanks, Tia, for saying that, because we think it's really important to continue on with these controlled release studies. We did have to conduct this controlled release study in Canada because the length of time for us to be able to get authorization to do it in the U.S. Due to the length of time for us to get the permitting was going to be very time-consuming. We also have received interest from the Canadian government to help support ongoing research in this area, and we would certainly appreciate some of those similar efforts in the U.S.
Good. Let me come back to Mr. Frankowitz, if I could. But would you, Mr. Frankowitz, please provide for us some examples of the additional benefits that promote the health and well-being of nearby communities with the kind of technology we're talking about here today? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Happy to. So there's really a multitude of benefits. So when you're talking about landfill gas control, as I've mentioned a couple times now, you're controlling gases across the board, and so there's immediate air quality benefits, but also something that's not mentioned often, but is a significant issue is odor. Not all landfills cause odors. A well-managed gas system certainly prevents it, but odor is probably the number one issue that local communities will complain of. And so things that you do to improve gas collection, reduce leaks, have bio covers, all reduce odors and hazardous air pollutants that impact communities. I'll give the example of Wake County in North Carolina. They were under an enforcement action for odor problems, and the way that they remedied it was through a combination of monitoring, finding and fixing leaks, and improving intermediate cover, and daily cover for their site. And that had an immediate impact. And then also the other part, this two-pronged approach I keep talking about when it comes to organics diversion, and not just diversion, right, but avoiding food loss, food waste. That's a food security issue. There's plenty of families that are food insecure, yet at the same time, we're throwing away food each year. And so things to reduce food loss, food waste, get that food into food banks, improves food security. And then lastly, we all talk about the benefits of composting. I think there's pretty strong support for that. But one of the things that I think it isn't mentioned often enough, one of the key reasons for composting organic waste is that you're able to actually recover those nutrients that are in soil. So all those nutrients that go into growing food, when that organic waste goes into a landfill, it's locked there. When you actually compost the food waste, that compost and those nutrients go back to the farms. So people always talk about, without farms, there's no food. Well, without healthy soil, there's no farms. And so it's really important to close that loop.
Yeah. One of my friends likes to say that composting is the gift that keeps on giving, and there's actually a lot of truth to that. I have maybe one more question for Mr. Germain and for Mr. Frankowitz. And my colleagues hear me say some of the things over and over again that I think bear repeating. I've often said that recycling is a win-win solution, and that's because diverting waste is not only good for our environment, it's also good for the economy. It's good for job creation. I'm always looking for win-wins. And there's so much that we're doing to protect our environment, to address climate change, that actually does create a lot of jobs. Jeff, welcome. Would each of you just take a moment while Senator Merkley's settling in, would each of you, Ms. Germain and Mr. Frankowitz, share some more information with us, if you will, on how organics, waste diversion can increase employment rates and contribute to economic growth. Do you want to lead us off on that?
Okay, so with respect to organics, obviously, as Tom already said, there's a lot of benefits to organics, composting or anaerobic digestion. You have a soil amendment. With anaerobic digestion, you have the opportunity to gain energy from that. The issue right now is that we don't have adequate infrastructure, so we would need to ensure that we had build up the infrastructure. And we definitely, I'll go back to, I know I'm repeating myself, but I'll go back to the labeling issue where we really need to focus on ensuring that the product that we create is usable as an end product, and so that we really need to focus on the contamination issues related to that, because everybody wants to be able to claim that their packaging is compostable, and it's just not the case with a lot of it. So we really need to be thoughtful and mindful as we move forward with diverting materials. As far as the comment about reducing our food waste, certainly I agree. We want to ensure that the hierarchy that EPA has established, we want to feed hungry people, we want to feed hungry animals first, but recognize that a lot of our food waste, if it's a banana peel, that's not going to be feeding anybody. We're going to want to end up managing that in a different way, and so that's going to end up in the waste system.
I might add, my colleagues, Senator Capito and our colleague from Arkansas as well, Senator Bozeman, are very much involved in like a recycling caucus, if you will, leading it. And one of the things we've done here, I believe in leadership by example. And one of the things we've done here on Capitol Hill is we have in our office, and I hope in every Senate office and hopefully in every House office, right in our office is the opportunity for our employees to
Recycle and
recycle plastic or metal, aluminum, metal, whatever, glass. We have composting capability as well, and we're pretty faithful, pretty good at it. I'm very proud. We could always do better, but I'm proud. Mr. Frankwitz, I want to come back, same question, then I'm going to kick it over to Senator Merkley. Again, what are some of the specific jobs associated with organics, recycling, and waste diversion? And then Senator Merkley.
So Mr. Germain, talked about the importance of moving up the waste hierarchy. And one of the things you see in moving up the waste hierarchy is the further up you go, the more jobs that are created. So roughly speaking, for every $10 million invested in waste management, there's 21.4 full-time jobs created in composting, while landfilling supports 8.4 to incineration's 1.6. So certainly, money invested in waste management creates jobs. But the further up you go up the waste hierarchy, the more jobs that are created.
All right, good. All right, Senator Merkley, welcome. Good to see you again. Twice in one day. We showed up for work together, and here we are together again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for bringing your expertise to the hearing today. I wanted to understand a little bit more about the monitoring of methane emissions. And Mr. Frankowitz, the traditional monitoring approaches, whether it's modeling based on assumptions or ground-based monitoring, and I think that's primarily done through an infrared technology, but perhaps you can clarify. Are those adequate to inform our approaches to methane emissions?
And I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the last part. Were you asking if the,
Are the traditional approaches, either just modeling based on pre-existing assumptions or kind of ground-based monitoring, sufficient to understand really the amount of methane that's emerging from different settings?
yeah. So they're not adequate, and we see two ways that technology can improve those estimates. So, generally speaking, the kind of landscape of technology you have, and some of it overlaps, but generally speaking, you have technology that is maybe more focused on emissions quantification, and others that are better at detection. So when it comes to quantification, the observations that are done through a network of satellites can both ground truth and improve the modeling methodology. It's not in a place to replace it, but it could certainly improve the measurements that are used for both modeling and inventory purposes. And when it comes to detection, their current methodology is highly subjective, and so there's technologies that drone assisted but still operated by people that drastically improve the chances of detecting and fixing those leaks.
So as we've brought these technologies to bear, satellite monitoring, drone monitoring, have we found that our original estimates of methane were on target, or were they significantly lower than what we're discovering?
They found that they're significantly lower, and in fact, EPA came out with a report recently on its greenhouse gas reporting program that generally found that the inventory underreported based on current modeling-based methodology.
Let me turn specifically to landfills. Do we spot super emitters like landfills better in terms of using satellite or drone technology? Is it helping us understand the large scope of the problem?
They are, and I'll certainly defer to Dr. Scarpelli on the specific technology. But one of the things that EMIT and other technology has shown is that you can detect these from space. When it comes to pinpointing those leaks, that's where it's helpful to use kind of a matrix approach to pinpoint these leaks. But you absolutely can see these super plumes from space.
Dr. Scarpelli, you want to amplify on that?
Yes, and I agree with Mr. Frankwitz's technologies is really important for identifying those high emitters.
So I've heard that the EPA has kind of drug its feet on contracting for methane, satellite-based methane contracting. What's that all about?
I can't speak to EPA's contracting. I would say there is a need to have federal support to help scale up these technologies and provide access to the data quickly, because that's one of the feedback we've gotten from operators is that it's really important to get the data quickly and have the data be transparent so that they can quickly fix leaks. I think that's one of the role that the federal government can play.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is something that perhaps we can follow up on because if we have this high-value satellite technology that EPA has been funded to contract for but hasn't contracted for, then maybe we can help accelerate that process to try to help tackle this challenge. So once we identify the particularly significant sites, and I was surprised to come to understand how significant landfills are. Do we have really the affordable technologies to be able to capture that methane out of landfills? Do we have the funding to tackle that challenge? Is it going to take more federal help?
I can speak to the monitoring perspective on that. We do have monitoring technologies that can help find these leaks, and these are being deployed at landfills, and really the key here is we just need to scale up the use of these technologies. I defer to others in terms of the availability of actual design changes that can be made to achieve the mitigation.
Yeah, the control technology is proven. It's gas collection, soil cover, finding and fixing leaks. These are things that landfills have been doing for a long time, but with advanced monitoring and doing in tandem, they're actually able to design these systems better and operate them better.
I just wanted to clarify that as we talk about finding the leaks, and certainly that's one of the things we're really interested in deploying these technologies for, is to be able to find the leaks and repair them as quickly as possible. The subtext seems to be that all the landfills have leaks. A lot of the measurements have been non-detects. So most landfills have no detectable leaks, and I don't know that that's coming across during this conversation. So as some of these flyovers and detections are occurring, most of the landfills don't have any leaks, but the landfills that do can have significant leaks that, if they're told about quickly, can be immediately repaired.
And I know I've one more time, so you can interrupt me, Mr. Chairman. My impression has been that when you have landfills that have been filled with gravel or soil, it's one thing, but when you have garbage and other things that are decomposing, it's quite another, and that's the place where you have landfills with really high methane emissions. Dr. Scarpelli, why do some landfills have, as pointed out, little methane, but others are significant emitters?
It's usually a function of the collection system. So even the municipal solid waste landfills that take all the organic matter, they have those landfills that have shown to have no leaks.
So it's a tribute to the effectiveness of the technology.
Right. And so as we've been talking about, if you can go rapidly, fix the leak, correct it, then it can be confirmed on the next flyover. They can confirm that there's no more leak from that facility.
Doctor?
It is true that, we do, speaking to how many emitters we see, we've surveyed about 300 landfills in the U.S., and we've seen 200 of those landfills have high emissions. It's not necessarily that the biggest ones are the ones with the biggest emissions, and the emissions do vary by site. We find that the landfill work phase is a major source of emissions, and then the landfill gas capture system is also, and this can be, if the wells are flooded, there potentially would have methane leak out of those wells. We've seen for the flare stacks, if the flare is down for a period of time, you can have methane leaking out of that. And so we've seen these varied emission sources across the landfill. And we've had examples as well where, we've identified the methane leak from surface cover, for example, and then the operator has gone in, made adjustments to the cover, we've flown it again, and we've seen the leaks have actually been reduced. And we've used the technology to verify that.
All right, no, that's very effective. So to the degree that there's organic matter in the landfill, do we see cities going, we'll reduce the methane leak by having a separate organic digesters to essentially produce methane and maybe put it into the fossil gas system, or in other words, keep it out of the landfill to begin with?
Keeping it out of the landfill is definitely the right approach. That will, in the long term, reduce overall methane emissions from landfills, but because you mentioned the waste in place, right? That decomposes for upwards of 50 years. And so unfortunately, you do have to do both at the same time. And just to put a finer point on Dr. Scarpelli's point about detecting leaks from space, I mean, I think some of these large super emitters you can see from space, and for sure that should be an area of focus. But that shouldn't be the rule of thumb, right? Only control what you see from space. And that's where near aerial observations and drone-based observations are important, because then you could look at, and we advocate for lowering the detection threshold from 500 ppm to something closer to 200 ppm. Because just because you can't see it from space doesn't mean you might have a large diffuse area source emissions across the cover, and that's where things like using biocovers and auto-tuning of wells to better control your gas can reduce those leaks that you may not see.
Hey, thank you all very much again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much for joining us, Senator Merklin, for your consistent and excellent leadership. We have a vote underway. I need to run and vote before time runs out. But before that, I'm going to telegraph my pitch. In baseball, the pitch of the week, you say where the pitcher holds the ball before he releases the ball to the plate. Sometimes you can figure out if they're going to throw a spitball, a screwball, like a hanging curveball, whatever. You can tell it that's by the way they telegraph their pitch. I'm going to telegraph my pitch, and I'm going to telegraph by saying I'm going to tell a quick story, and then I'm going to come back to each of you and ask you to take maybe a minute and just tell us where you think there's a really important common ground that we've heard here in this hearing. It's been an excellent hearing, and we're grateful for that. But just be thinking about that. Now I'll tell you a story. I've been a naval flight officer in the Vietnam War, and spent half my time in Southeast Asia with my squadron, and half of our time flying out of Moffett Field Naval Air Station, which is right on Route 101, across from Mountain View, California, about halfway between San Jose and San Francisco. And I mentioned earlier some of the things that I've learned by going back to that part of the world, and about, among other things, anaerobic digestion. First time I ever learned about it was on a visit back out there to see our son, one of our sons. But when I left Delaware, when I left California, moved to Delaware to get an MBA, to continue to fly with the Navy and the reserves for another almost 20 years. And my first week or two in Delaware, I understand in the MBA program, and we had to find, one of our assignments in this one course was to find a company in Delaware that was always in the news for getting in trouble with the Delaware Department of Natural Resources or with EPA, and then do a study of that and report back. I found out, I didn't know much about Delaware, but I found that they had an oil refinery called Getty Refinery, like it's in J. Paul Getty, right in the Delaware River, Delaware City. And I decided I'm going to do my research project on that refinery, which is one of the worst polluters on the East Coast. And I found out that the person who I should talk to about their violations and all was actually a deputy attorney general down in Dover, Delaware. And that if I could track him or her down, that I could really get a lot of help on my assignment. And I drove in my Volkswagen Carmagia with a rebuilt engine from Newark, Delaware, where the university was, to Dover, Delaware. I found Dover, Delaware. I found the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. I found the building where the Deputy Attorney General for that agency was working, and I found him on the second floor of that building. His name was Mike Perkowski, and he could not have been more helpful. He welcomed me warmly. I'd been in Delaware a couple of weeks. He welcomed me warmly, provided access. He had filing cabinet after filing cabinet of violations from the Getty refinery. Gave me access to that, a desk to work in. I would come back week after week and do my research and all. His wife offered to type write my research paper for me. I didn't need any help, but I certainly appreciated all the help that he provided. And Mike Perkowski has a son. And I think you might know the son, and his name is also Mike Perkowski. And what does he do today? You turn on your mic and tell us what he does.
Mike is responsible for a lot of the outreach and government affairs and policy work for the Delaware Solid Waste Authority.
And just last week, my staff and I visited the educational facility that they have in Dover, Delaware, where probably tens of thousands of students come every year and learn about recycling and our planet and so forth. And he does a great job. So it's nice to see that one generation follows another. I'm going to ask, again, each of you to take just a moment now and just share with us the common ground that I mentioned earlier. And Tom, if you want to lead off, that'd be great. Just briefly.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Carper, for that story. And for
Isn't that a great story?
And also for that.
I just made it up. So. Not really.
Well, I appreciate the time. It allowed me to get my thoughts together.
There you go. That was the idea.
Well, I mean, I think hopefully what you can see here by the different points we're making, they don't differ very much.
No.
I mean, I think we agree on more than we disagree on. There's since the 2016, the last update of the NSPS standards for landfill gas, the technology has advanced rapidly. And, there's technology today that we could use to better find and fix leaks, identify super emitters, and better inform models and inventory. We're already collaborating with the waste industry in identifying some of these solutions. We'd like to continue that. And we'd like to see EPA join us in this effort by incorporating these advances into stronger Section 111 standards.
All right, great, thanks. Dr. Scarpelli.
Yeah, and just to second that, we have seen here today that landfills are large methane emitters. Not all landfills are large emitters, and there's huge potential for mitigation in the role of advanced monitoring is to guide mitigation practices, to identify the leaks, help the operator go through, and also verify that once the mitigation has taken place, that emissions are actually reduced. There's also a role for, accounting for emissions, and this will play a role for climate policy, that we need to know, our models need to be accurate, and so using the data as well to help inform models and inventories will also be important.
All right, thank you. Mr. Mayan.
So we have made tremendous progress over the last 30 years. As I stated in my opening remarks, we have reduced our methane emissions by about 45% since 1990. However, that still means that we have a long way to go, and we recognize that. We are committed to meeting the global methane pledge made by the administration of reducing our methane emissions by another 15% by 2030. And we are committed to using technology to help support those efforts.
All right, great. Thank you. I'm going to wrap it up here, but in wrapping up, I just want to thank each of our witnesses for your preparation and for taking the time to join us today. I want to thank you for what you do with your lives. And there's a lot of important issues that we consider in the Senate and in this room, but I don't think any's any more important than the one we're discussing here today. And as we've heard, we have the tools at our disposal to really, I won't say quickly, but expeditiously reduce methane emissions from landfills. We're doing it. We can, as we said earlier, we can always do better. But new technologies to detect and quantify emissions, when combined with techniques to avoid and capture methane emissions, not only drastically or dramatically reduce emissions, but can also create new jobs, new job opportunities. And I'm always about how do we do good things for our planet and create jobs at the same time, and they actually can work together. Implementing these tools effectively can improve the health of our communities and slow the progression of climate change, a true win-win situation. I look forward to working with my colleagues, Democrat and Republican, on this committee and in the full Senate to continue this conversation, make real progress in reducing landfill methane emissions. Before we adjourn, just a little bit of housekeeping. Senators may submit questions for the records until the close of business on Wednesday, February 14th. When is Valentine's Day? Is that Valentine's Day? No. What a day to remember. We will compile those questions and send them to our witnesses. We'll ask our witnesses to reply by Wednesday, February 28th. And before I adjourn, I just want to say to our staff members on both the Republican and Democratic side, majority and minority, how much we appreciate, on behalf of my colleagues, Senator Carper, how much we appreciate the work that went into making this hearing occur. This has been a great hearing, and I think an encouraging hearing. In the world that we live in, there's a lot to be worried about and concerned about. And this is one, certainly climate change is a big one, but there's good work that's being done, important work that's being done. And we've heard about how we can do that even better going forward. And with that, is that a wrap? With that, it's a wrap. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you all very, very much.